December 16th, 2004. An Amber Alert flashes across the Midwest, but the missing infant has never taken a single breath of outside air. A 23-year-old woman is found dead on her own living room floor in a pool of blood. Her abdomen has been violently sliced open, her 8-month fetus surgically extracted and stolen. It is a crime so visceral and deranged that seasoned investigators freeze at the threshold. A cradle sits empty, while a predator drives away with a stolen life. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Skidmore, Missouri, functioned as a quiet agricultural hub where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons rather than the news cycle. In late 2004, 23-year-old Bobbie Jo Stinett lived there, navigating the quiet expectations of a rural existence. She had married her husband Zeb the previous year, and the two occupied a modest, well-maintained home on a parcel of land where they pursued their passion, breeding and raising rat terriers. Bobbie Jo was described by those who knew her as soft-spoken, deeply devoted to her dogs, and possessed of a gentle disposition. She was not a woman of great public ambition. Her world revolved around the immediate needs of her kennel and the small, personal milestones that define a young marriage. By the fall of 2004, that world was expanding. She was 8 months pregnant with their first child, a daughter they had already decided to name Victoria Jo. The pregnancy was a focal point of her days. She shared the news with enthusiasm within the online circles she frequented, communities dedicated to the breeding and showing of rat terriers. It was a digital extension of her local life, a place where she felt comfortable, supported, and connected to others who shared her specific obsession. Her home was an accumulation of preparations. Baby clothes were neatly folded, a crib stood ready in the nursery, and the final weeks of gestation were marked by the typical anxieties and profound anticipations of a first-time mother. Zeb worked long shifts as a machine operator at a local plant, meaning Bobbie Jo spent significant hours alone at the residence. She was comfortable in this isolation. She was a fixture of the Skidmore community, a person whose day-to-day presence was as unremarkable as it was steady. There was no dissonance in her life, no conflicts that drew attention, no debts that threatened her security, and no enemies who sought her harm. Her engagement with the internet was primarily professional and social, revolving around the exchange of information regarding litters and health standards. She was active on specialized forums where, under her own name, she meticulously tracked the pedigree of her terriers. It was here that her path inadvertently crossed with someone else, someone whose presence in those forums was not born of an interest in dogs, but of a desperate, pathological craving for the life Bobbie Jo was carrying. The psychological landscape of Skidmore was one of total trust. Neighbors rarely locked their doors during the day, and the idea that a predator might be observing the routine of a pregnant woman from behind a glowing computer screen was an alien concept. Bobbie Jo existed in a bubble of rural safety, oblivious to the fact that her personal joy had become an object of intense clinical obsession for a stranger monitoring her updates from hundreds of miles away. She was preparing for a birth. The person watching her was preparing for a theft. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would dismantle the safety of the town and force the residents to acknowledge that malice could be imported into their isolated geography with nothing more than a dial-up connection. The early internet of 2004 was a largely unpoliced frontier, characterized by niche message boards where enthusiasts gathered in absolute trust. For specialized breeders, forums like Ratter Chatter served as digital town squares. Users uploaded pixelated photos of new litters, debated the merits of specific bloodlines, and openly shared milestones from their personal lives. It was an insular space, insulated by the assumption that everyone logging on shared the same harmless obsession. For the expectant mother in Missouri, interacting on these boards was a comforting daily ritual. She posted updates under her real name, documenting both the growth of her prize-winning terriers and the steady progress of her pregnancy. Among the screen names regularly interacting with her posts was a newcomer calling herself Darlene Fisher. The initial contact was innocuous, focused entirely on the dogs. Darlene claimed to reside in neighboring Kansas and expressed a deep admiration for the Missouri woman's breeding program. But the interaction quickly pivoted to a more intimate subject. Darlene presented a biographical detail carefully calibrated to lower any remaining psychological defenses. She stated she was also in her 3rd trimester, expecting her first child. This fabricated persona was a masterclass in predatory mirroring. By mimicking her target's exact biological and emotional state, the person behind the keyboard bypassed the natural skepticism usually reserved for strangers. The digital exchanges soon transcended animal husbandry. They discussed the physical exhaustion of late-stage pregnancy, the anxiety of impending motherhood, and the meticulous preparations underway in their respective nurseries. Darlene was profoundly attentive. She asked detailed, supportive questions regarding the baby's movements, the chosen color palettes for the crib, and the precise dates of upcoming medical appointments. Behind the glowing monitor of a desktop computer located 150 miles away in Melbourne, Kansas, sat the architect of this elaborate deception. The woman crafting the identity was a 36-year-old mother with a deeply fractured psyche. Her physical reality stood in stark, terrifying contrast to the joyful anticipation conveyed in her emails. Operating from a rural farmhouse, she was facing a catastrophic collapse of her personal life. A web of intense falsehoods she had spun over several months was rapidly unraveling, creating an urgent, inescapable crisis. She required an infant, not through the legal channels of adoption, but instantly, convincingly, and entirely off the grid. Her digital stalking was exhaustive. She studied the online footprint left by the breeder with clinical precision. By analyzing the backgrounds of the puppy photographs posted to the forum, she mapped the layout of the victim's home. She absorbed the daily schedules mentioned in casual chat threads, noting the long shifts worked by the husband at the local manufacturing plant. The predator understood that rushing the process would trigger alarm bells. Instead, she maintained a steady, patient cadence of friendly correspondence throughout the autumn. She positioned herself as a supportive confidant, a fellow expectant mother navigating the exact same physical milestones. This psychological alignment formed the bedrock of the trap. The victim believed she was nurturing a genuine friendship, completely unaware she was providing a detailed topographical map of her vulnerabilities to a stalker. As the calendar flipped to December, the digital relationship reached its calculated terminus. The online grooming needed to transition into the physical world. The premise for the face-to-face meeting was flawless, rooted entirely in the legitimate business of the kennels. Darlene Fisher expressed an urgent desire to purchase a puppy. She claimed to be looking for a specific coat pattern and temperament, details she knew would engage the breeder's professional pride and obscure any ulterior motives. Emails were exchanged to finalize the logistics. Darlene proposed driving up to the Skidmore residence to view the available litter in person. The timing was suggested casually, yet calculated with lethal precision. It was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon, a specific window when the husband was guaranteed to be miles away on the factory floor, leaving his wife alone on the isolated property. The victim, seeing only a routine business transaction with a friendly online acquaintance, readily agreed. She provided turn-by-turn driving directions to her rural home, noting the specific landmarks off the main highway and the visual indicators of her driveway. She tidied her living room, secured the dogs, and prepared for a customer. On the morning of the scheduled meeting, a final email was transmitted across state lines, confirming the estimated time of arrival. The message was warm, brief, and entirely deceptive. The target was acquired, the location was secured, and the trap was locked. The virtual illusion was about to evaporate, replaced by the physical arrival of a woman who had packed her vehicle not with cash for a puppy, but with the grim instruments required to harvest a child. The temperature in northwest Missouri hovered just above freezing on the afternoon of December 16, 2004. A pale winter sun offered no real warmth, casting long, stark shadows across the barren agricultural fields bordering the town. Down the quiet stretch of the victim's street, a red Toyota Corolla slowed to a crawl. The vehicle crunched over the gravel driveway, parking near the modest single-story home. The driver stepped out into the bitter air. She did not look like a threat. She appeared exactly as she had portrayed herself online, a slightly heavy-set, unassuming woman in the late stages of pregnancy. She wore loose, accommodating clothing. She carried herself with the heavy, deliberate gait of an expectant mother. But beneath the fabric of her coat, secured and hidden from view, she carried a thick length of neon pink rope. Inside the residence, the homeowner was waiting. She had secured her larger breeding dogs in their rear enclosures, leaving only a select few puppies out in the main living space for the prospective buyer to examine. When the knock came, she opened the door without hesitation. The greeting was cordial. The two women moved from the cold entryway into the warmth of the living room. The layout of the house was compact, forcing a close, intimate proximity between the host and her guest. The conversation remained focused on the animals. The visitor played her role flawlessly, asking specific questions about the puppy's temperaments and bloodlines, feigning a deep professional interest. But her eyes were actively scanning the environment. She was checking the sightlines from the front windows. She was listening intently for the sound of a returning vehicle. The house was entirely isolated. It was completely silent, save for the muffled yapping of the terriers in the back room. The facade vanished in a fraction of a second. The transition from a casual business transaction to lethal violence was absolute. The young mother turned her back, perhaps to point out a specific dog, perhaps to retrieve a pedigree document from a nearby table. The guest moved with sudden, practiced speed. The neon pink cord was whipped out from beneath her coat. It went over the victim's head. It snapped tight across her throat. The struggle was not brief. It was a violent, chaotic, and agonizing fight for survival. The victim was heavily pregnant, carrying significant extra weight, and thrown completely off balance. But she fought with the raw, primal ferocity of a mother protecting her unborn child. She clawed desperately at the rope biting into her neck. She reached backward, tearing thick strands of blonde hair directly from her attacker's scalp. The two women slammed into the surrounding furniture. Knickknacks crashed to the floor. The physical exertion was immense. The attacker's hands gripped the ends of the cord with white-knuckled intensity, twisting the rope, pulling backward, and utilizing her entire body weight for leverage. The victim's air supply was entirely severed. Blood vessels in her eyes ruptured from the extreme pressure. The room echoed with the muffled, horrific sounds of a desperate fight for oxygen. Heavy scuff marks smeared across the linoleum floor as boots kicked and dragged. Eventually, the physiological lack of air dismantled the resistance. The young woman collapsed onto the living room floor. Her attacker did not let go. She maintained the agonizing tension on the rope, kneeling over the body, holding the ligature tight until every muscle twitched and finally ceased moving. The living room fell quiet again. Only the rapid, heavy breathing of the killer broke the stillness. Murder was not the primary objective. Murder was simply a necessary biological hurdle. The true goal was locked inside the victim's body. Time immediately became the critical factor. The fetus was actively losing oxygen with every passing second that the mother's heart remained stopped. The attacker abandoned the rope and sprinted to the kitchen. She bypassed the standard silverware and retrieved a sharp kitchen knife. She rushed back to the living room, dropping to her knees beside the lifeless body. What followed was a brutal, crude approximation of a cesarean section. There was no anesthesia. There was no surgical precision. There was only a frantic, mechanical butchery executed against the clock. The blade sliced downward through the fabric of the victim's clothing. It penetrated the flesh of her abdomen. Blood poured out onto the linoleum in a massive, pooling hemorrhage that quickly soaked into the carpeted edges of the room. The heavy, metallic scent of copper saturated the enclosed space. The cuts were deep, jagged, and reckless. The predator plunged her bare hands into the open abdominal cavity. She gripped the 8-month-old infant and violently pulled her out into the cold air of the living room. The baby girl was alive. The attacker severed the umbilical cord. She clamped the raw, bleeding end, ignoring the massive, catastrophic trauma she had just inflicted on the mother. She wiped the newborn down with a towel snatched from the adjacent bathroom. She wrapped the stolen infant tightly in a blanket. The entire extraction had taken only minutes. The intruder stood up. Her hands, her forearms, and her clothes were heavily stained with arterial blood. She walked straight out the front door, carrying the newborn, leaving the mutilated remains of her victim splayed open on the floor. She climbed into the red Toyota Corolla, started the engine, and backed quickly out of the driveway. The gravel crunched a final time. She merged onto the rural highway, accelerating north, putting miles between herself and the slaughterhouse she had just created. Inside the residence, the absolute silence returned. The afternoon sun shifted lower in the sky, casting long, dark shadows across the gruesome scene. Just after 3:30 p.m., Becky Harper pulled her vehicle into the driveway. She had spoken to her daughter earlier that day on the telephone. This was intended to be a routine visit, a quick daily check-in between a mother and her heavily pregnant child. Becky walked up the concrete steps to the front door. She turned the brass knob. It was unlocked. She stepped into the narrow entryway. The atmosphere inside the house felt immediately wrong. The temperature was off. The dogs were highly agitated, whining and pacing relentlessly in their enclosures. Becky called out her daughter's name. There was no response. She took a few more deliberate steps down the short hallway toward the main living area. Then, she saw the floor. The visual impact was paralyzing. Her daughter lay flat on her back. Her maternity clothes were completely saturated in a dark, rapidly coagulating pool of blood. Her abdomen was laid completely open, a horrific, gaping wound, exposing her internal organs to the air. The sheer volume of blood obscured the precise nature of the trauma. The human brain completely rejects anomalies of this magnitude. In her initial, blinding shock, staring down at the ruptured stomach, Becky's mind grasped for any logical medical explanation. She genuinely believed her daughter's abdomen had spontaneously exploded from the pressure of the pregnancy. Becky grabbed the nearest landline telephone. Her hands shook so violently she could barely punch the numbers. She dialed 911. The dispatcher answered immediately. The audio recording of that ensuing call captures the exact sound of a human psyche fracturing in real time. Becky screamed into the receiver. She wildly informed the operator that her daughter's stomach had burst. She begged for an ambulance, her voice tearing at the edges. She dropped the phone and hovered over the body, desperately trying to find a pulse, her shoes slipping in the thick blood that coated the linoleum. First responders were dispatched instantly. Local paramedics arrived within 4 minutes, rushing to what they believed was a severe medical anomaly. They burst through the front door, carrying heavy trauma bags and oxygen tanks. They took one step into the living room and froze. This was no medical emergency. The seasoned paramedics instantly recognized the dark, bruised ligature marks burned deep into the victim's neck. They saw the jagged, deliberate nature of the abdominal incisions. The cut was not a rupture, it was an extraction. They immediately backed away toward the door to preserve the scene, radioing for law enforcement backup with absolute urgency. Nottoway County Sheriff's deputies arrived moments later, securing the perimeter with crime scene tape. They walked through the house with their hands on their holsters, clearing the remaining rooms. They found the nursery. The crib stood empty. The baby clothes remained perfectly folded. The horrific reality crystallized for the investigators standing over the blood-soaked floor. The young mother had been strangled to death, and her unborn child had been carved directly from her womb. The infant was gone, the killer was gone, and the clock on the newborn's survival was ticking down fast. The Nottoway County Sheriff's Department faced an investigative nightmare. The crime scene inside the rural farmhouse was pristine in its horror, but entirely devoid of obvious forensic breadcrumbs. The attacker had vanished without leaving a murder weapon, a clear set of fingerprints, or an immediate direction of flight. The only certainty was the critical, rapidly closing window of survivability for the stolen infant. A newborn, violently removed under highly unsanitary conditions, faced catastrophic physiological risks: hypothermia, severe infection, and untreated hemorrhaging. Law enforcement immediately activated the Amber Alert System, a national protocol designed specifically for abducted children. But this particular activation was completely unprecedented in the history of American law enforcement. The alert network fundamentally required data: a photograph, a height, a weight, an outfit. Dispatchers sitting in the regional command center had absolutely nothing to input. They were forced to broadcast a bulletin for a child who had never been legally documented, never been photographed, and never taken a breath outside the womb. highway digital boards across Missouri, Kansas, and Iowa illuminated with a desperate, painfully vague plea. Authorities were searching for a red compact car, possibly a Honda or Toyota, and an unidentified female suspect carrying an unnamed newborn. While state troopers locked down the interstate corridors, a separate contingent of investigators drove to the local manufacturing plant, where the victim's husband was finishing his afternoon shift. He was pulled directly from the factory floor and escorted into a quiet administrative office. There, officers delivered the news that dismantled his entire reality. He was told his wife was dead and his unborn daughter had been surgically stolen. The husband collapsed under the sheer, incomprehensible weight of the information. As dictated by standard, unforgiving investigative procedure, detectives immediately vetted him as a potential suspect. They scrutinized his timeline, verified his electronic clock-in records, and extensively interviewed his coworkers. His alibi was ironclad. He had been operating heavy machinery miles away during the exact time frame of the slaughter. The grieving father was swiftly ruled out, leaving investigators staring back into a terrifying void. Back in Skidmore, the social echo of the crime triggered a localized panic. This was an isolated agricultural enclave of fewer than 300 residents. The conceptual barrier between the safety of a Midwestern farming community and the depravity of a metropolitan homicide was instantly shattered. Residents who had not turned a deadbolt in decades suddenly locked their doors, pulled their heavy blinds, and armed themselves. The psychological contagion was severe, radiating outward across the county line. Pregnant women in neighboring towns called local obstetric clinics in a state of sheer terror, canceling routine medical appointments and refusing to leave their homes. Rumors multiplied rapidly in the absence of hard facts. Theories circulated through the tight-knit community with terrifying momentum. Some speculated the attack was the work of a highly organized black market adoption ring operating out of a major city. Others whispered about fringe cult activity or a deranged drifter passing through the plains. The reality that a predator had calmly driven down their quiet streets in broad daylight, knocked on a front door, and executed a surgical theft felt entirely apocalyptic. The temperature plummeted as dusk settled over the state, dropping well below 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The biting cold added a brutal layer of urgency to the search efforts. By nightfall, the search grid had expanded massively. The FBI was brought in to assist the highway patrol. Helicopters equipped with forward-looking infrared cameras swept over the freezing, barren cornfields, searching for the heat signature of a dumped vehicle or a discarded infant. Canine units scoured the frosted ditches along the local routes. Troopers set up hard roadblocks, shining high-powered flashlights into the back seats and trunks of every vehicle exiting the rural perimeter. Inside the residence, crime scene technicians wearing sterile white Tyvek suits worked under harsh halogen lights. They mapped the blood spatter, bagged the severed neon pink rope, and dusted the door frames. Yet the physical search yielded absolutely nothing of immediate value. The red car was gone. The landscape had swallowed the perpetrator whole. Detectives standing in the blood-stained living room realized that traditional boots-on-the-ground police work was failing to generate a solid pursuit vector. The killer had left no physical trail leading away from the property. To find the missing baby, investigators needed to stop looking at the frozen dirt roads outside the house and start looking into the digital ether that had brought the monster directly to the front porch. The investigative focus shifted abruptly away from the floor and locked onto the glow of the personal computer sitting quietly in the corner of the room. The Nottoway County Sheriff's Department was fundamentally equipped to handle rural burglaries and localized domestic disputes, not a hyper-calculated fetal abduction. Realizing the physical landscape held no immediate answers, investigators cordoned off the blood-soaked living room and turned their attention to the victim's desktop computer. The beige plastic tower was carefully bagged and transported to a regional cyber crimes laboratory. The hardware itself was entirely unremarkable, but the hard drive contained the only viable map of the predator's movements. Forensic technicians cloned the drive to preserve the integrity of the data. In the sterile, temperature-controlled environment of the lab, a stark contrast to the slaughterhouse left behind in Skidmore, they began a tedious, systematic excavation of browser histories, cached files, and incoming email registries. Initially, the digital sweep yielded only mundane data. Analysts waded through online shopping receipts, utility payments, and emails from local relatives. The hours dragged heavily. The frustration within the command center mounted exponentially as detectives simultaneously chased physical dead ends on the ground. Troopers interviewed local delivery drivers, mail carriers, and known neighborhood eccentrics, generating zero actionable leads. Every passing minute statistically degraded the newborn's chances of survival. Detectives were hunting a ghost across a frozen county, while the answers sat locked behind a password-protected screen. The critical pivot occurred late into the night. Technicians scanning the internet cache isolated a series of communications tethered to the specialized breeding message board. They reconstructed the final weeks of the victim's digital life and uncovered the extensive, heavily documented correspondence with the user known as Darlene Fisher. The emails detailed the exact Thursday afternoon meeting time. It was a digital smoking gun. However, identifying a screen name was merely the first barrier. Investigators needed to pierce the veil of the alias. They immediately drafted emergency subpoenas for the forum administrators and the internet service provider hosting the specific email account. In 2004, acquiring ISP logs required navigating a dense labyrinth of federal warrants and corporate telecommunications bureaucracy. The delay was agonizing. Detectives paced the linoleum floors of the precinct, fueled by stale coffee and raw adrenaline, waiting for a server in another state to spit out a string of routing numbers. Just before dawn on December 17th, the ISP complied. The data packet arrived, and the email address belonging to the phantom buyer resolved to a specific IP address. It was a standard dial-up connection. Technicians traced the geographical origin of the node. The signal did not bounce around the dark web or hide behind complex encrypted proxies. It traced directly to a residential broadband account located in Melbourne, Kansas, an agricultural community situated roughly 150 miles south of the crime scene. The account was not registered to a Darlene Fisher. The billing information named a man, Kevin Montgomery. Because the abduction had crossed a state border, the FBI instantly assumed lead jurisdiction. Background checks were rapidly run on the Melbourne address. The homeowner lived there with his wife, 36-year-old Lisa Montgomery. When intelligence analysts pulled her profile, the bizarre architecture of the crime began to take a sickening, cohesive shape. Information gathered from local Kansas authorities painted a deeply disturbing picture of the household. Montgomery had been loudly and publicly claiming to be pregnant for several months. She had attended community events in maternity clothing, accepted gifts, and fully decorated a nursery in her home. Yet, medical records quickly obtained by federal agents revealed a biological impossibility. She had undergone a bilateral two-ball ligation in 1990. She was entirely incapable of conceiving a child. Further investigation exposed a looming, catastrophic crisis in her personal life. Her ex-husband had recently discovered her deception and was threatening to expose her fabricated pregnancy during an impending, highly contentious custody hearing over their biological children. He demanded medical proof of her condition. The psychological pressure cooker had reached its absolute breaking point. The walls of her reality were collapsing. She didn't just want a baby, she needed a physical infant to present to her community and the family courts to maintain her rapidly deteriorating web of lies. The transition from intelligence gathering to tactical deployment was immediate. A multi-agency task force, comprising FBI tactical units, Missouri State Highway Patrol, and Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents, converged on Osage County. A convoy of unmarked black SUVs tore down Interstate 35. The atmosphere inside the vehicles was suffocatingly tense. The agents knew exactly who they were hunting, but the physical condition of the stolen infant remained a terrifying unknown. Melbourne was a town even smaller than Skidmore, boasting a population of fewer than 400. The convoy exited the highway and navigated a grid of rural dirt roads, killing their headlights as they approached the target coordinates. The property sat isolated amid barren winter fields. The crunch of frost beneath the tires was the only sound. Parked squarely in the gravel driveway was a red Toyota Corolla, matching the exact description of the vehicle spotted idling in Missouri the previous afternoon. It was mid-afternoon on December 17th. Less than 24 hours had elapsed since the horrific extraction. Heavily armed federal agents surrounded the perimeter of the Kansas farmhouse. They moved with absolute, silent precision. The metallic clack of rifles being readied echoed sharply in the frigid air. The tactical commander assessed the sightlines and gave the definitive signal. They breached the front door. The interior of the home was instantly flooded with tactical operators shouting commands. They moved rapidly through the narrow hallways, clearing rooms and securing the occupants. Kevin Montgomery was detained in the living room, entirely bewildered by the sudden militarized invasion of his residence. Agents stacked up and breached the master bedroom. Sitting on the edge of the mattress was Lisa Montgomery. She was casually watching television, and resting quietly in her arms, wrapped tightly in a soft blanket, was a newborn baby girl. The suspect did not panic. She did not attempt to flee, nor did she reach for a weapon. Instead, she stared blankly at the armored tactical team and calmly stated that the child was hers. She informed the agents that she had unexpectedly gone into labor the previous day and delivered the infant at a women's clinic in Topeka. The operators ignored her fabricated narrative. A tactical medic attached to the entry team immediately stepped forward and separated the infant from the suspect. The visual assessment of the child was nothing short of miraculous. Despite being violently carved from a dying woman's abdomen just hours prior, transported across state lines in a freezing compact car, and handled by a desperate predator, the baby was breathing steadily. The umbilical cord had been crudely severed and clamped, but she was alive. Montgomery was placed in heavy steel handcuffs and led out to a waiting federal vehicle. She walked silently past the red Toyota, its interior still containing microscopic traces of the unimaginable carnage she had left behind. The stolen infant, Victoria Jo, was secured in a specialized incubator and rushed by ambulance to a pediatric intensive care unit. The physical machinery of the abduction had been completely dismantled, leaving investigators to sift through the psychological wreckage of a woman who had crossed the ultimate moral boundary to sustain a delusion. The interrogation of the suspect unspooled a timeline of escalating, terrifying desperation. She had meticulously fabricated her condition for 9 months, completely deceiving her current husband and her entire community. The definitive catalyst for murder was a looming custody hearing with her former spouse. He had grown deeply suspicious of the situation and intended to demand official medical proof in front of a judge. If her lie was exposed, she faced the immediate loss of her existing children. The intense psychological pressure fractured her reality. She required a physical prop to sustain the deception, and she was willing to harvest it by any means necessary. Because the abduction crossed the Missouri-Kansas border, the case bypassed local jurisdictions, triggering a federal prosecution for kidnapping resulting in death. Defense attorneys heavily emphasized the suspect's history of severe mental illness and profound childhood trauma, arguing she suffered a complex psychotic break that rendered her incapable of understanding her actions. The prosecution dismantled that argument using the exhaustive forensic data harvested from her hard drive. The digital footprint, the weeks of patient grooming, the calculated selection of an isolated target, and the precise scheduling of the Thursday afternoon meeting demonstrated absolute cold-blooded premeditation. It was a surgical strike, not a spontaneous loss of sanity. The federal jury reviewed the digital timeline alongside the sheer physical brutality of the extraction. They systematically rejected the insanity defense. The perpetrator was convicted on all counts and handed a federal death sentence, a highly unusual judicial outcome for a female defendant in the modern legal era. On January 13, 2021, the federal government executed the convicted killer by lethal injection at a penitentiary in Indiana. The procedure closed the legal chapter of the case, but it offered no true equilibrium for the town of Skidmore. The Stinett family remains forever altered by a crime of unfathomable theft. A stolen daughter was recovered and raised surrounded by family, yet an inescapable paradox defines her existence. Her birthday will always serve as the anniversary of her mother's brutal slaughter. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.